For our coding project, we chose to do locating invasive species in the state of Vermont. So to start with a little bit of background info about invasive species in general, an invasive species is defined as a non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration, and a species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health and other species in the environment. Invasive species may not have any natural predators or controls. They can breed and spread quickly, taking over an area, which can be very harmful to the native species of that area. And native wildlife may not have evolved defenses against this invader, which does not enable them to compete with the species that has no predators.
So our species of interest is the hemlock woolly aldergid, more commonly referred to throughout this presentation as HWA. It's a tiny insect from Southeast Asia that attacks forest and ornamental hemlock trees, and it feeds at the base of needles, making them dry out. The trees end up losing their green color, and the needles can end up also falling off. They're native to Japan, and it was introduced to the United States in the 1920s to the Pacific Northwest, and in the early 1950s to Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. The species has spread throughout the East Coast through wind, birds, mammals, human activities, and also infected nursery stock, which has increased the species damage to hemlock. Just some more information on HWA's environmental impact. The species has sucking mouth parts that feeds on sap and at the base of hemlock needles into parenchyma cells, which are nutrient transport cells. These large infestations of the species can deplete trees of their vital nutrients. HWA also allows for the loss of needles, as mentioned, and it can also reduce the growth of new needles and branches. This is due from the fact that HWA feeds on young twigs, causing needles to dry out and drop prematurely. The trees may also die anywhere between 3 to 6 years, and this further affects other wildlife as the trees that survive have sparse foliage, losing value as shelter and the ability to shade streams. And then climate change is also expected to increase the impact of HWA in the future, which is why we are trying to infer areas in Vermont where the species may expand to in order to help conservation efforts for biodiversity.
So how we went about doing this for our methodology and data collection, we decided to conduct a suitability analysis to detect where invasive species, or HWA in this case specifically, would be most likely to settle using a multitude of variables. How we did this is that we generated a weighted sum raster using all these variables to record point data of HWA populations in Vermont and then assess the accuracy of the predictive model that we created initially. This is based off a study by Kusikska in their article on assessing the potential distribution of invasive alien species, Amorpha fruticosa, in the Mers floodplain natural park in Romania, and they used GIS and logistic regression for this study. And we additionally used the intermediate lab back from Intermediate GIS, which worked on bobcat modeling and used a similar suitability analysis. And in terms of data, we got data from Geodata Vermont, the United States Geological Survey, PRISM, which is out of Oregon State University, as well as data.gov, which is data from the Census Bureau. So to outline our pseudocode and the steps we took to achieve this analysis, we first imported necessary models for analysis and set up our workspace. Then we went on to process and normalize data based off of the different variables and file types. So to cover a little bit of each of these, we used the slope spatial analysis tool to find the slope based off of digital elevation models. We used the Euclidean distance spatial analysis tool to determine closeness to streams and roads. We use the reclassify tool to determine land cover and reassign values, with the higher values being what were more populated by plants and the lower with less, and this would show what attracts the invasive species to the area. We rescaled continuous data, which included slopes, roads, and streams to keep a 0 to 1 range to keep that uniformity throughout the study. Additionally, we standardized NDVI data to the 0 to 1 range, which helped remove atmospheric interferences in the raster image like clouds and water. And we also standardized the temperature and precipitation data through z-score normalization using NumPy. After all of this was done, we performed a weighted sum to account for all the standardized variables. We extracted values to table and used this table to do a histogram analysis. And lastly, we used locate regions to finalize a raster map so that we can compare the actual point data of the invasive species to our predictive model.
Okay, so next we're going to look at a couple of the snippets from our code. So this is an example of the standardization of precipitation and temperature raster data where we use z-score standardization to normalize the values between 0 and 1, and we utilize the module NumPy to do so. So this just entailed calculating the mean and standard deviation in order to calculate the z-score to standardize the data. Then on this slide, it depicts our weighted sum, which all our standardized variables, including distance to streams, distance to roads, land cover, slope, and NDVI, which is vegetative cover, was all compiled in order to produce our suitability maps. And then, as mentioned in the pseudocode, we used extract values to tables to combine point data of the HWA species we previously queried out and the weighted sum to understand the accuracy of our model. And as you can see, the histogram of our data is slightly right skewed, indicating a positive distribution, but it also means that our model accuracy probably could be improved.
So then to examine what our final map outputs looked like, if you look at the one on the left, this showcases the region in which HWA is predicted to expand or cover more of Vermont in the future. And the image to the right shows the habitat suitability of the weighted sum or all of the variables of the invasive species.
And then our third and final map shows an overlay of the predicted distribution cover within the weighted sum.
So to wrap things up for our analysis, the first cover, we had some issues while running our code. Some of our variables wouldn't show up in our project folder, like the roads, for example. And additionally, reclassification for our land use took over 2 hours to run. So for these two files, we got permission to run them in ArcGIS Pro and export them into our folder to use for our analysis. Our histogram analysis at the end showed a right skew distribution, which means that overall it could use some work and fine tuning. And in terms of our maps, we ended with a final predicted area in northern Vermont. Our map showcased the predicted range by itself, the weighted habitat suitability by itself, and the last one showed an overlay of the two to showcase the predicted range in regards to the weighted habitat model. And in terms of future analysis, we could first find more variables that were better suited for the HWA to make the weighted sum more accurate, and this could just involve a little bit more research on the species. We could additionally find more point data for the invasive species to better assess the accuracy of the predictive model at the end. And we lastly could use updated and more current data on certain points, such as the NDVI data. And to finish off, here are the sources that we used to research it.